Let's talk a little bit more about South Indian classical music, and finally we get our map here. Shows how it's divided in north and south, and if you can see it's not nearly equal in land area. North is a much larger land area and a greater population as far as that goes. The Carnatic music comes from that southern region in blue. So in traditional Carnatic music, the pieces are organized or based on specific raga and tala. So it might be, a similar idea to Beethoven writing a movement of a piano sonata in D major and in 4/4 time. But it tends to be much more complex than European classical music, based on a specific raga, specific scale plus, and specific tala rhythmic cycle, which can be improvised quite substantially upon. Some elements of the performance are preconceived, while others are spontaneous, improvised according to set rules. Nothing is random in here, but there may be a certain melody that's a traditional melody, and that will be presented, and then, for lack of a better word, the musicians will jam on that melody and jam on the raga upon which that melody is based. There's a lot of improvisation going on. And so, in that sense, the performer functions as both interpreter and creator in a performance. And that is in direct opposition to Western classical music, where the performer is interpreter only. So, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart writes a lovely piano sonata, and the people that perform that piano sonata from the mid-1700s on to 2010 are supposed to, they can take liberties with the tempos and how they do certain things in interpreting the rhythm and scale patterns within a very narrow range of acceptability. And other than that, they're not supposed to change the melody that Mozart wrote. They're not supposed to change the harmony that Mozart wrote, but just interpret such peripheral things as tempo, dynamics, things like that. So classical music in India, in the north and the south, much more improvisatory in nature, and the performer has a much greater role as a co-creator, if you will. So typical performance values that are very important to zero in on, and we'll hit this quite a bit in this presentation and the next presentation. Most traditional, and we got to make that distinction. I'm talking traditional Indian music starts slow and gradually gets faster. It tends to start more soft or more mellow and get gradually louder or more intense. And the texture of the piece will move from more sparse or thin texture to a more dense or thicker texture. The performance gets busier, if you will. There are more intense rhythms from the drummer. There are more faster moving notes and runs and more virtuosic displays of technique from the melodic performers, singer or instrumentalist. And we will take some time to examine all those things. South Indian Rhythmic Organization. There are two main membranophones that you see pictured here, Mridangam and the Dholak. The tala rhythmic cycles are often quite complex, and you'll see some videos where you see an example of how that works. Sometimes Western musicians, myself included, find it very difficult to follow along in those rhythmic cycles, but the average Indian citizen has no problem following. It's just a different kind of way of approaching rhythmic organization. Okay, got another video here. I'm going to tell you some things to look for, and then you can watch. So again, longer performance, 7.5 minutes, and we're going to take a look at the first minute just to get an idea of how the mood is set. Now this is Mridangam solo, but the drone is present. So the first thing you'll see, in addition to the Mridangam player, is an older gentleman who is kind of like the master musician of this group here, and these other musicians, these younger musicians, are his proteges. And he is doing some things with his hand movements that visually transmit the rhythmic cycle that's being used. So watch the first minute. Oh, and then you also see in front of him, near the floor, a small box, and that is the Shruti box that's producing the drone digitally. It's kind of like a digital keyboard without the keyboard, because all they need to do is keep those drone tones going. Then as you see another young man clapping, moving, sometimes hitting the front of his hand, the back of his hand, waving certain fingers in the air, creating again a visual representation of the rhythmic cycle or the tala that's being used. And then the drummer himself, we watch the first minute, and then we move over and watch the third to fourth minute, and then we move over to 6 minutes and watch the last minute and a half. And hopefully you'll notice that the rhythm cycles get, or the improvisation on the cycle gets a little bit more busy, a little more intense, a little faster. So watch this and get a sense of how these rhythmic cycles work and the rhythmic complexity that is here in South Indian music. All right. Besides those visual representations with the hand movements, we have mnemonic vocables for learning tala. I can't remember if we've talked about mnemonic devices in this course yet, but you probably are familiar with this from other classes. A mnemonic device is something that helps you to remember certain things. A very common one that most cultures are familiar with is Roy G. Biv, which helps us to remember the colors you find in the rainbow spectrum. Red, orange, yellow, that's Roy. G, like a middle initial, for green. And then Biv for blue, indigo, and violet. So that's a common example of a mnemonic device. So we have mnemonic vocables for learning the tala patterns. And you're going to experience this in a demonstration at some point here in one of the videos, but let me just take you through this right now. I've written out an example here in this slide where each one of these syllables represents a different kind of finger stroke or palm stroke on a specific head of the drum. So here's a common one, a pretty simple one for beginning drummers. Da, din, din, da, da, din, din, da, da, tin, tin, ta, ta, din, din, da. And that's the whole cycle, and then would get repeated. Now this one has the virtue of being pretty easily analogous to 4/4 time. So if you're in a computer lab, you're not going to feel comfortable doing this, but if you're somewhere where you feel comfortable speaking this along with me, let's try it together. So I'll count 1, 2, 3, 4 to get us started, and then I'll go through that cycle. 1, 2, 3, 4. Da din din da da din din da da tin tin ta ta din din da. Now, once the apprentice drummer gets used to this pattern, then they speed it up greatly. Let me see if I can do this without getting tongue-tied. Da din din da da din din da da tin tin ta ta din din da, and keep doing it over and over again. You want to try that? Okay, if you're in a place where you don't feel self-conscious about doing it, let's go for it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Da din din da da din din da da tin tin ta ta din din da da din din da da din din da da tin tin ta ta din din da. So you see what I did there, and then they can go much faster than either you and I could hope to go after just trying it a couple times. So you will see some of these things coming up in some videos and get a sense of this. Okay, here we go. All right, let's break this down a little bit. You're going to watch the first about a minute and a half on this, and hang in there. He starts out very slowly. He's trying not to lose people. And then you get the general idea of how these syllables relate to the different hand and finger strokes. And then I'm going to move it to the 5-minute mark, and he's going to launch into something that's much, much longer and more complicated. He's still not going fast, but it's like so much to remember in one long cycle. Most dancers here in modern Western society learn things by 8 counts, for example. And some of you have had that experience of being in a dance group. And so you learn a bunch of moves that go for 8 counts, and then you learn the next 8 counts, and you keep putting 8 counts together. Here he's stringing together, I don't know, 32 counts or more all in one, and expecting the student to remember that right off the bat. And then he demonstrates it. So I'm going to watch it from about 5 minutes to 7 minutes. So 3.5 minutes of this demonstration, 2 different places, just so you get a feel of how these mnemonic syllables work.
If you practice well, you will get the speed. Don't worry, you will get it. Provided you have to start practicing at the lower tempo. You have to practice that way. If you practice gradually, the speed will increase. You will get that speed. The next lesson, as I told in the previous lesson, Kita is the base. So the same way, in this lesson, the bass stroke is Kita, Kita, Ta, Ka. I say it slowly. I know you can't understand at this stage. Kita. It should be played twice. Kita, Kita. Okay? And Ta, Ka. Ka is nothing but D. Don't forget. Ta, Ka. I say it together. Kita, Kita, Ta, Ka. Kita, Ki. We covered all those basic lessons, and we can fix various patterns using these basic lessons. The first pattern is Ta, Di, Tum, Nam, Ta, Kita, Di, Kita, Dum, Kita, Nam, Kita, Ta, Ta, Di, Tum, Nam, Nam, Ta, Kita, Di, Kita, Dum, Kita, Nam, Kita, Ta, Di, Dum, Nam, Nam, Ta, Kita, Di, Kita, Dum, Kita, Nam, Kita, Ta, Di, Dum, Nam, Ta, Kita, Di, Kita, Dum, Kita, Nam, Kita. we switch over to the second pattern. Ta, di, tum, nam. Ta, kita, taka, ta. Di, tum, nam. Di, kita, taka, ta. Di, tum, nam. Tum, kita, taka, ta. Di, tum, nam. Tam, kita, taka.
Right, next we talk about some representative South Indian musical instruments. And first of all, it's interesting that they have an indigenous classification system that corresponds pretty well to the S&H classification system. For instance, what we would call chordophones, they call tatavadyas. And in this composite photo here in this slide, you're seeing a lot of different things. Kind of leaning against that keyboard, that reed organ, is the North Indian sitar, made famous by Ravi Shankar and others. You have several other, well, one other chordophone I can see there, and the harmonium, the air-driven reed organ, would be considered a chordophone as well. Sushiravadyas are aerophones. The flute is a very common example of that. We have the Avanada Vadyas, I guess is how you pronounce that, the membranophones. And you see a number of them there. You see a very colorfully painted mridangam. You see tabla drums there as well from North India. And you see, let's see, in this, it's kind of hard to see in this particular composite photo, the idiophones, the ganavadyas. There you have some things that correspond to tambourines, which of course are idiophones. And they also have a clay pot. There's an idiophone that's pretty common in traditional Indian music. The most representative melodic chordophone, as I mentioned before, is the veena, spelled several different ways here. The characteristic chordophone of South India. It has melody-producing strings and drone strings, so although the drone may be produced by another instrument or by the digital drone box, this melodic instrument also has its own drone strings. Next instrument is the tambura, or sometimes spelled tampura, and that's a characteristic traditional drone instrument in both North and South India. 4 strings tuned to the first and fifth notes of the raga, what Westerners would call open fifths, corresponding to do, sol, both of those, and octaves of those as well. So basically you'd have, let's see, something like do, sol, and those strings would be tuned to those notes, and this player, it looks like he's doing something with his left hand, but he's actually only steadying the instrument. The right hand will keep the strings sounding, keep plucking across the strings and creating those drone notes. To summarize what we've talked about today, India is one of the areas with millennia-long cultural traditions, so we call it a cradle of culture. We've discussed that South India is more purely Hindu or more orthodox Hindu in cultural attitudes. And our next presentation, we'll see a little bit more of the nuance of that. We looked at the melodic materials of traditional Indian music as raga, or scales plus. We've considered the tala rhythmic cycles. We've considered that the 3 main elements of traditional Indian music is melody, drone, and rhythm. And I hope you're picking up on the fact that the word harmony is not in there. So harmony, which is such an important part of European-derived music, folk music or classical music, is not an element of traditional Indian music. Drone is technically a kind of melody, or harmony, excuse me, because our first definition we learned for harmony was 2 or more pitches sounding simultaneously. But I guess what we could say to be accurate is that there's no functional harmony. There's no 1, 4, 5 chords cycling around and creating harmonic variety, as you often have in Western popular music and Western classical music. We talked about the fact that the performer in traditional Indian music is both the interpreter of pre-conceived or pre-composed music and creator of new music through improvisation. We talked about three main values in traditional Indian music: slow to fast, soft to loud, and sparse to dense, or thin to thick. And those ideas create a sense of musical momentum. They create a sense of moving the music through time. There's a cute little clip here about keeping the tradition alive. Let's check that one out.
Okay, bubbly பாடு சரிகம பனிசா தாளத்தோட பாடு சா ரி கா மா பா டா நீ சா சா நீ ட ப ம க டி சா. Okay, ஜண்ட வரிசை பாடு ரெண்டு ரெண்டா சா சரி ரி மெதுவா பாடு சா சா டி டி கா கா மா மா பா பா டா டா நீ சா 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 நீ நீ டா டா பா பா டா 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 நீ வேகமா ஃபாஸ்டா பாடு சா சா டி டி கா 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 பா 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 டா டி டி சா.
That, of course, was a young Indian mother teaching her daughter the traditions of the raga. And those syllables that you heard are the Indian equivalent, maybe, of do, re, mi, fa, sol. So you can imagine a mother in the West, a young American mother, for example, teaching her young child, a 4-year-old daughter, that age, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and having the child, repeat that back and learn to memorize those syllables of the scale. So one of the many ways that the Indian culture and the Indian citizens are keeping the traditions alive. And that last example creates a nice setup for the next presentation on Indian music. So until you get a chance to look at that, I'll say aloha.